Alright guys, today we're going to be covering the installation process for fuel injectors and fuel delivery tubes for a 5.9 Cummins common rail. Obviously this engine is out, but the procedure is the same if the engine is in the vehicle. So we'll be covering the torque specs, this torque sequence, and all the important information you need to know about installing fuel injectors. Alright, so obviously this is a fuel injector. This still has a cap on it. You got to make sure obviously that this is removed. All this does is protect this tip and it keeps this sealing washer on the injector. These are reman injectors. If you are not replacing injectors or you don't have new injectors, you need to make sure you have a new sealing washer and a new O-ring for this. Now when you go to install these in the bore, you need to make sure you lube this O-ring, and I also put a tiny bit of grease or assembly lube if I can't get this to stay on the tip of this on the copper washer just to hold it in place. I've done that with thousands of injectors and never had a problem with it. The other thing that I would recommend doing is, I'm not 100% certain on these engines, but on some electronically controlled engines, the numbers on these injectors are very important to calibrate per cylinder. I don't think you have to do that on these engines, but I'm going to document it with pictures, the numbers on each injector and which cylinder it's going into. Okay, like I said, I don't think that's needed on these engines, but just in case it is, I want to make sure I had this information so I don't have to pull these out again. All right, and see this little hole right here? This hole has to line up with this hole in the block, because these holes are where the injector tubes go. So obviously there's only two ways you could install this way or this way. It's pretty obvious which way is the hole for the hole to be lined up. Make sure your bores are nice and clean before you put these in. And again, I'm going to document with pictures which cylinders these are going into, just in case. All right, so if you can't get this pushed in by hand, most injectors, honestly, you can just push them in with your thumbs to seat them initially. These ones are not going in by hand, which is just the catching on the O-ring. If that's the case, then all you need to do is work down these injector hold down bolts a little bit at a time, each side, a couple turns at a time, and get it seated all the way down. There is an inch-pound torque specification for seating it that you would torque it to and then release it. Because keep in mind, we don't have the tubes in yet. This is just seating the injector. It's just getting it seated in the position so you can put the tube in and it's mated properly, but you don't want to torque it all the way down until the tube is in there so it's aligned properly. All right, that's seated, so then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to back these off. So it's nice and loose. All right, so this goes into that hole in the injector that I was showing you on the side of the injector. And that is a crush fit, which means when you torque this down, it crushes a little bit, and that's what seals this to the injector. This is what delivers the fuel from the fuel line to the injector. So that if this is off too much, it might be off just a little bit, which is why you don't torque this down all the way, because then when you push this in and you tighten this down, then it will clock that injector just those little like millimeters that it needs to be properly aligned. But if it's too far off, it will just score that injector, or it won't line up properly, and then it will be a fucking disaster. So after you get this seated down, then you are going to be putting your injector tube crossover tube, fuel delivery tube, whatever you want to call it. It's also important to lube this O-ring as well. And these, it is recommended, like the fuel lines, but I don't think it's as important to replace the fuel lines every time as it is to replace these. I have had and seen a lot of issues with people not replacing these because they're too cheap when they take injectors out. Every single time this injector is taken out, this needs to be replaced, regardless of whether or not the injector is replaced, because this is a crush fit. So that's important. These have a little keyway. I don't know if you can see that on them. Properly aligns them into this bore. And if you feel around, you can feel that torque specification for this of 133 inch-pounds, but if you push it with your fingers, it's pretty easy to get in there. But I will be tightening this down just a little bit, just to snug it up just a hair. And then again, we'll move on to the torquing of the injector. If I can find my wrench. All right, again, I'm just gonna snug it just a little bit. Just a little bit. And then we're going to torque our injector clamps. Alternating. And then take your wrench and snug this up pretty good. And then you're done. Try to avoid getting any kind of dirt or anything into these. Make sure these areas are clean. Again, do not put pressure, like downward pressure, on the top of this injector. This is plastic, okay? The solenoid is delicate. Also, do not turn the top of this injector, okay? It is torqued down, so it's not like you can turn it with your hands, but do not be cranking on the top of this injector, because that is actually what calibrates this injector. So you will fuck up the calibration if you turn that. Again, I will be documenting pictures for these for every cylinder, just in case I do have to go get it calibrated. I don't have to take everything apart again and figure out which injector is in which cylinder. So. All right, so I'm just gonna finish this install here in a sped up version. I didn't cover this earlier. If you're still having a hard time getting that injector seated, you can use a soft rubber mallet like I just did, that handle, and push down or kind of tap that injector hold down clamp to get it to go down. If you're doing this or you have to do that, make sure those washers on the end of the injectors are secured really well, either with grease or just already secured and stayed, because you don't want to knock those off. But you can do that. You just be careful. Obviously, I'm not hammering on the top of the injector itself. It's just the hold down clamp, and I don't have to tap it very hard. Those O-rings were just not going in very easy. But I know this was a long video, but I just want to make sure I cover this because a lot of people get this wrong and end up having issues with their injectors. So that is the installation process for fuel injectors on pretty much any system that has in-head fuel delivery tubes. So thanks for watching, guys, and I will be updating you guys on this build again when I start assembling the rest of the engine.